Welcome to The Intersection, a series on the IQT podcast where we discuss topics relating to the intersection of technology and national security. Our guest today is General David Petraeus, U.S. Army retired, who is one of the leading battlefield commanders and strategists of our time. He served over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer. He subsequently served as director of CIA during a period of significant achievement in the global war on terror. General Petraeus is now a partner with the global investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he established in 2013. He also recently published the book Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. General, thank you for joining us here today.
Great to be with you, Steve. Great to be back with In-Q-Tel, and thanks for all you've done over the past 18 years. 16 and a half as the number 2, and now the last year and a half as the CEO.
Thank you, and it was a great pleasure to work with you when you were director of CIA. You were one of the big supporters of ours, and we greatly appreciate that.
Easy to support a great organization.
Thank you. So let me start with the basics. What prompted you to write this book?
Well, Andrew Roberts, my co-author, this is his 20th book, but the first for which he ever had a co-author, great historian, great biographer, called up from London and said, the Russians have just invaded Ukraine. There's no book that provides the military historical context for it. How would you like to write it with me? And it'll be titled Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. And I jumped at the chance. There were several reasons for that. Number one, to work with someone of his extraordinary caliber. I've known him well. We've done a lot of events together in the past in New York and London and elsewhere. But then number two was I'd been looking for a vehicle to reflect on, to record the history and reflect on it, the 2 wars that I commanded, Iraq and Afghanistan, was involved with them in multiple different positions over the years, culminated in each case with command of that. And then also to revisit Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Princeton, but decades earlier with lots of additional scholarship, declassification, and papers since then. So for all of those reasons, it was really a wonderful opportunity. We had great fun putting it together. We had great fun during the book tour. We were really gratified to make the New York Times bestseller list, which is not that common for military history. And we just, in fact, sent the 2nd edition, which actually changes the subtitle, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza, because we added a chapter on Gaza, updated Ukraine, and also the chapter on the future of warfare.
Fantastic. I don't think I've seen the 2nd edition, so I'll have to.
Mid-October.
Okay. So that's why I haven't seen it yet. So, well, I look forward to that, and we'll get it later in the questions, your perspective on Gaza.
Absolutely.
But as you dug in, sometimes I talk to people who undertake one of these sort of macro history books that you've done. Were you surprised by what you realized once you dug in?
To a degree. We made sure up front in the introduction to lay out what I've long felt is the most important component of success or failure, the determinant of success or failure on the battlefield, though there are others, but that has to do with strategic leadership. And we emphasize the 4 tasks of a strategic leader, literally the individual at the very top, so as I was in Iraq and Afghanistan as a 4-star, where you have to get the big ideas right, craft the right strategy, communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization to all those stakeholders, oversee the implementation of the big ideas, what we often normally think of as leadership, the energy the leader provides, the example, the inspiration, getting great people, allowing those not measuring up to move on, the organizational architecture you design, the metrics, how you spend your time, your battle rhythm. And then a 4th task, which is formally sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas to do it again and again. And I was convinced, and I used this, starting with the surge in Iraq, and then in my subsequent strategic leadership positions. We used this as a prism through which we looked at the different conflicts we examined. And what jumped out at me in particular on Vietnam was that we failed to get the big ideas right for 13 years, from 1955 to late 1968, when finally General Abrams took over. And instead of trying to win a war of attrition with North Vietnam, which we could not do, with search and destroy operations, which often did a lot of damage, sometimes created more enemies than we actually took off the battlefield, that we finally got to a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign but it was just too late by that point in time. And the body count metric was the wrong metric. It should have been something having to do with the security of the people. Now, I had a sense of this at the 10-year mark when my dissertation was published, but much, much more so with all of the additional reflection. And then, frankly, with respect to Iraq and Afghanistan, but some of the others as well, where we did certain tasks really well, toppling the Saddam Hussein regime. I was a 2-star, in fact, for that. Toppling the Taliban, eliminating the sanctuary in which al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks, but then made some very serious errors along the way. Early on in Iraq, for example, firing the Iraqi military without telling them how we're going to enable them to provide for their families and themselves, and then firing the bureaucrats, essentially, the level 4 of Saddam's Ba'ath Party. But they were, again, just the people we actually needed, tens of thousands of them, mostly Western educated, that we needed to run a country that we didn't sufficiently understand. And we never really fully came back from that, rectified that, until frankly during the surge, when the country was so far out of control that in certain parts of it, I could do whatever we wanted to do because there was really no meaningful Iraqi governance. And we created a reconciliation process to deal with the former Ba'ath Party members. And then we also tried to further build the Iraqi security forces and so forth. And frankly, I had to reverse the big ideas, change them 180 degrees. I mean, change leadership. We taught you can't do any more than completely reverse what it is you were doing, from clearing and leaving to clear, hold, and build, which was the major big idea for that. And then in Afghanistan, where it took us 9 years just to get all the inputs right, that's more than just the big ideas, which finally General McChrystal, my predecessor, got right at about the 8-year mark. But then the additional forces, the right organizational architecture, the additional diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law experts, et cetera, the right preparation of our forces, the right leaders individually, all the rest of this. So again, that means that 9 years we squandered a tremendous opportunity during which there was very low violence, and the Taliban gradually reconstituted in Pakistan, then came in and continually made life more difficult. So again, those were very big, and I had a sense of these going into this, but when you really examine it the way we did and then look at it through the prism of this task of a strategic leader, it just sort of jumped off the pages at me.
By the way, just as an aside, for the entrepreneurs and CEOs listening to this podcast, I think you take your principles of strategic leadership and apply it to running a company as well.
Absolutely.
Right? And I'm sure you do that in your current role.
A great example is Netflix. You know, like the 4 incarnations. You know, the first is put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. Undercut Blockbuster goes out of business. Second is broadband speeds are fast enough, so allow them to download. Third is we're going to make our own content. 100 million on House of Cards. Fourth is going to make major motion pictures, buy 2 movie studios, and win more Academy Awards than anybody, or nominations than anyone else. And again, it applies in the startup world, in your world, in the venture. I'm invested in 30 startups individually, and then in addition to the ones where I participate with KKR, so the early stage ones and later stage as well. And these are absolutely applicable. So the founder of a startup is very much a strategic leader. You at In-Q-Tel are the strategic leader. And these 4 tasks, and we flesh this out a lot more, and those that really want to get into this can go to belfercenter.org, that's at Harvard, a website, and search for Petraeus on strategic leadership. And we distilled all this and explained it. A bunch of graduate students who had worked for me in the war zones helped me do that some years back. And that, again, this strategic leadership intellectual construct, I think really is very, very valuable.
And one of the challenges I can imagine that you had in your role would be, even as you are trying to get the big ideas right, you get a lot of sort of stakeholders or people who think they're stakeholders in what you're doing, right, that have different ideas for you. So how do you shut out the noise, and how do you get the stakeholder community that exists around you on board with your set of big ideas?
Well, first of all, the development of the big ideas, you should always do it as openly, transparently. It has to be iteratively by nature. It should be inclusive, all the rest of this. But the truth is, for the surge in Iraq, I knew what the big ideas needed to be. We had spent the previous year, my one I had 5 combat commands. There was one that was non-combat. That's where we controlled all the leader development for the entire Army, the training, the doctrine, and we did the counterinsurgency field manual. So we distilled the lessons that we needed to have learned, and we hadn't. I mean, here we were several years into counterinsurgencies, and we didn't actually have a doctrinal field manual. So, and then it's about communicating. So it was the process of doing that is very important.
Right.
And then, and including naysayers, including
Right,
those that will challenge you. So that's very, very important. Then ultimately, though, you do have to make decisions, and you won't persuade everyone.
Yeah.
By the way, if you can't persuade the bulk of them, you probably have to look at the big ideas again. But there will be people, and then there will be folks who have a stake in something that's contrary to what you do, such as some of the service chiefs were afraid that the surge was going to break their service. One of them said, Mr. President, I'm afraid this could break my service. The president was pretty quick on that one. He said, I'll tell you what will break your service, General. That's losing a war.
Right.
Provide the forces to Petraeus. So the surge, I had the president's backing. And even though, again, my immediate boss and some of the Joint Chiefs were not all that supportive and really didn't think it was going to work, they also lacked confidence. We believe we had the right big ideas and that we really could flip Iraq, actually, not just change it, but truly transform it from a serious Sunni Shia civil war to drive and ultimately drive violence down by nearly 90% in the 18 months that we had additional forces on the ground. But there you just have to have a degree of conviction, of fortitude. But again, if you have the president has your back.
Right.
When he declared the surge, keep in mind he had largely subcontracted or allowed the Secretary of Defense to run the war up until just a month or two before the surge. When he and I remember meeting with him after being confirmed, and he said something like, "General, we're doubling down in Iraq." I said, "Mr. President, your military is going all in, and we need the rest of government to go all in." He said, "I will ensure that that is the case." So he took over the Washington end of the war, and a major manifestation of that was he started a meeting of the National Security Council, 7:30 every Monday morning to 8:30, started right on time, the whole team around the table. Imagine this on a Monday morning in Washington. Nothing happens in the White House before 9 or 10. And he's in the chair, and he immediately goes to the ambassador and me. He doesn't ask anybody around the table, how do you think things are going in Iraq? That was a game changer because we knew at the end of the day, if we did not go there, Ambassador Crocker and I didn't take over our respective positions intending to lose gracefully. We were determined to turn this around. And happily, the big unknown I had was, can we change it enough? Can we generate enough improvement in the 6 months before I have to go back to Congress and testify? That was staring us in the face. And about 8 or 10 weeks prior to that, all of a sudden violence started to go down. And there was a number of reasons for it. The enormous success of our men and women in uniform and our coalition and Iraqi counterparts in executing, turning these big ideas into reality on the ground. But that was really, really helpful. If you don't have that, of course, you got to really invest a heck of a lot in persuasion, which you should be doing anyway. I also believed in being very accessible to the press. I believed that, I wasn't just communicating the big ideas within the organization. It's to everybody who has a stake in the outcome. So this is America's mothers and fathers, spouses, number 10 Downing Street, the Iraqi White House, our White House, Congress, parliaments, everything else. And you've got to do a lot of that. I was sometimes in the subsequent administration described as a celebrity general, which was not always a term of endearment. But I felt that I had to do that. That there was most of the participants prior to the surge who were still around, and the Secretary of Defense left, had called their credibility into question a bit by some more overly optimistic assessments at times when subsequently it was proven that that was not correct. And so I realized that I had to be the face of the war, certainly in Iraq, and set about doing that. And so part of my battle rhythm included, my schedule included an awful lot of interaction with the press and a ton of interaction with members of Congress, obviously with the president, others. And that's important. I think you have to do that.
I agree with that. So looking across the set of conflicts that you did you come to any conclusions of those four principles? Which one's the hardest to pull off?
Oh, number one.
Getting big ideas right.
Strategic. If you don't get the big ideas right, it doesn't matter how good your communication skills are, how inspirational, what an example, all the rest of these other tasks will be building on a shaky intellectual foundation. So you have to get that right. And again, I was just stunned at how many times strategic leaders in combat failed to get those right. I mean, the French failed. I mean, Dien Bien Phu was a really, really bad big idea. And of course, they're defeated there. And actually, soldiers had to surrender. And then eventually led to the partition of Vietnam into North and South. Algeria, again, flawed big ideas there as well. Now, there are other factors. I mean, it's tough. These are all post-colonial kinds of situations which proved very difficult, although the British did it magnificently in Malaya. That's where Hearts and Minds actually first emerged. They were fantastic in the Falklands, Oman, another, always different circumstances. And of course, in Malaya, it helped that they could say, we're going to give you your independence, but of course, we got to defeat these communists first. So that particular task is the one that has to be the focus of a strategic leader. In fact, when I'm often asked, what do you think the most important quality or qualities are for a strategic leader? It's judgment. Again, you assume that they will have the other reasonable skills. You know, maybe the interpersonal or communications will be better or not so, but whatever it may be. But the one that you've got to have is, again, strategic judgment. And I remember being asked, in fact, because the 3-star level in Iraq, I was the 4-star, but even at that level, there was still an enormous latitude for them to determine the big ideas where the focus would be operationally or with their special mission units or some of the other major subordinate commands. And they asked me, what do you seek in your 3-star operational commander, in particular, the multinational corps Iraq? They said, do you look for somebody who can run with you? Because I think they were trying to butter me up because I was a big runner and all this stuff. And I said, did you look at General Odierno? Did you look at, the general who's now our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin? These are former interior linemen or something. I mean, these aren't going to, this is the Clydesdale school if they could run at all. They probably had bad knees. I think they did. So that is irrelevant. I mean, they have to have stamina. They have to have general good fitness and so forth, and endurance and all the rest of that, and then all the other qualities. But it really comes down to their judgment, because they're the ones that are laying this out. Yes, I eventually approve it, but it's very, very seldom did I ever not approve what it is that they brought to me, because they had exceptional judgment. And of course, General Odierno did the first half of the surge, went home, and he came back and replaced me. General Austin did the second half of the surge, went home, and then replaced General Odierno. And both of them were absolutely brilliant in Iraq. And the genius of them was getting the big ideas right. They could feel this stuff. And that's what's really important. And the truth is, again, we didn't have the big ideas right before that. We did for a period, then they were invalidated by a terrible event that touched off the Sunni-Shia civil war.
To your point, it's not just about getting big ideas right initially, It's that's feedback loop at step 4 of analyzing what's going on and what's changing.
Remember Kodak, the champion, the most important company in film photography and related services, had 2,000 patents on digital photography, but failed to make that the new big idea early enough to capitalize on that. And they got beat by others, and they've never been the same.
I think it's very challenging, and you know, some of the folks at HBS, Harvard Business School, have written about this, You get that initial big idea right. It's really hard to recognize that it doesn't last. And that you have to disrupt yourself in some form.
Well, you know, I sat down with Reed Hastings and discussed Netflix, because I had this conception of the different stages. They also, of course, took it global. That's another big idea, and a handful of others. But the real distilled 4 iterations that I mentioned, and talked about the model. He has a very similar model. The key to keeping them right is you actually have on your battle rhythm, on your schedule, events and activities that enable you to identify how you need to refine the big ideas. In some cases, force you to do it. So we had events on my schedule that I acknowledged were action-forcing mechanisms. They're there to make me make a decision, because if we want to be, and the staff would finally say, General, you know, we've been doing this every week now for 2 months, and you deferred. You've got to decide now where it is we want to be 6 months from now if you want to have a process that gets us there, given all the layers between you and the actual soldier on the ground under body armor with Kevlar and weapon, who's doing what only they can do, which is engage the enemy and engage the local population.
Right. Yeah. So you've convinced me that this is the right way to think about these things. How accepted do you think this is within the U.S. Department of Defense these days?
I think it's uneven.
Yeah.
First of all, the model itself is not something. Come to think of it, I probably should have put that in doctrine somehow.
Right, yeah.
I did capture it, as I said, after leaving government
Right, yeah,
with
yeah.
the help of the team at Harvard, and I've tried to promote that,
Right,
if you
yeah.
will, in a way. I've put this in numerous different essays, books, articles, interviews, and so forth. Perhaps, again, we should have made it doctrinal. It's a great question that you raise. In fact, I should note that every 30 days, every month, I would do a secure video conference with the individual who replaced me at Fort Leavenworth, had the same responsibilities, these 16 different schools and centers and responsibilities. And I would convey to that individual what we'd learned on the battlefield, because I didn't want to just learn it in Iraq. I wanted it to be learned by the Army. And it starts with changing the doctrine, then organizational structures, then how you train the force, leader development, all the commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer courses, material requirements, personnel related issues, facilities, and so forth. So that's really how you need to look at it. You need a structured, I've just recited an acronym called DOTLM's PF, by the way.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. And one of the things we'll get to maybe in some later conversations, but I'm convinced of watching the technology evolve on the battlefield, is the iteration rate of how technology
It's so
is being
rapid
applied.
now.
It's so rapid now.
We are not doing that well enough right now in the U.S. military.
And it doesn't communicate back to the training of the soldiers, right?
That's why you have to institutionalize it. And it's driven by getting the doctrinal changes, and we're very slow with doctrine. The only manual that has ever been produced in less than a year from start to finish was the U.S. Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual, and I drove that together with Jim Mattis from the Marine Corps, and I was determined that we're going to get that published by the end of the year. It never happened before, but I had the total support of the Chief of Staff of the Army, whose instructions to me when he sent me out to Fort Leavenworth were to shake up the Army. And I said, Chief, I can do that if you have my back. He said, I will have your back. And then the Training and Doctrine Command Commander had been my boss during the fight to Baghdad, General Wallace, another great commander, and he had my back as well. We have to do it much faster. If you look at, I think one of the lessons emerging on the battlefield in Ukraine is how rapidly they're doing software changes. They're producing every week. They're producing 1 million cheap, effective suicide drones in 12 months. That's thousands of drones every day at the enemy. And by the way, they're about to unleash robotic dogs, which are going, and again, the iteration. I've been there 3 times just in the last year alone. I go again in September. I mean, how does a country that has no navy destroy 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and drive them out of the port of Sevastopol? It's with aerial drones that find them and maritime drones that sink them. So again, then the pace there, we can't do that remotely. We will have some exquisite system. It'll go through the requirements process, requests for all the rest of this stuff.
I talk to any operators, or any operators talk to in Ukraine, and you hear the same thing, which is anything that starts working for us has a shelf life of 2 weeks. You know, in 2 weeks the Russians will figure out.
Will adapt to EW.
EW.
They've rendered our most effective, most accurate artillery rounds ineffective. Inaccurate. EW, and we haven't reacted quickly enough. And our systems tend to be much more expensive. They can be much more exquisitely capable, but you don't need exquisite capability. You need thousands of cheap suicide drones.
Exactly. I can't agree more strongly with that. But
and that's what InQtel is designed to do. And happily, I'm now, told. I used to do intelligence, of course. I'm now told that there are actually some military clients of yours who are funneling money to you, which is an indicator that maybe they don't have all that they need in that regard, perhaps within the greater Department of Defense, one would
absolutely.
perceive.
But coming back to the point about the iteration cycle, I think one of the consequences of that is it has to distribute decision-making out to the field.
It does. You have to, again, and by the way, in Iraq, so I had my own counterinsurgency guidance that I published in Iraq, Afghanistan as well, and distributed it about every 6 weeks. I'd hit the send key with a new iteration. It would go to every soldier in the force. And one of those, it would start out, for example, secure and serve the people. There's a series of admonitions. We can only do that by living with the people. We have to go back, clear, hold, and build.
Right.
Promote reconciliation. Pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly. Promote greater civil military. There was one that said promote initiative, because again, it's a small unit leaders war, and that's what I'm trying to do. And it said after promote initiative, in the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively.
Right.
And that's a culture. That's what you have to instill, which means that they're going to they're going to figure out what they should do, and they're going to do it even if somebody hasn't told them. And that's the kind of culture that you need. It has to be a culture of rapid learning. Right. My agreement with Secretary Gates was, look, if you have something back in the States based on a material request that we have, and it won't kill somebody when it's first as a prototype, just send it out. We'll put it in the hands of soldiers. If it works, we'll order a heck of a lot more really quickly. If it doesn't, we'll park it in the back of the combat outpost and let it rust. But that's the approach, and Gates was spectacular at this. I couldn't get my own service, even as a 3-star, to produce V-shaped hull wheeled vehicles that would deflect the blast of an IED. We were still in up-armored, flat-bottomed Humvees, which could be devastated by that kind of blow because it was flat. It didn't distribute it. Same with drones. He eventually replaced the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, in part because they were not sufficiently embracing rapid production of drone crews and also of drones. There were some other issues as well. But that's what it takes. And he had the longevity in the job. Keep in mind, he not only did it for the final couple of years of the Bush administration, but then also for several years of the Obama administration, the first ever to be under Republican and Democrat. And he loved to drive that system, actually. He actually reveled in bureaucratic knife fights. And he did it, but that's what it takes to do it. And we haven't really had that kind of combination of forceful leader, longevity, really since him.
I actually think this whole concept of distributed decision-making or empowerment of the soldiers at the edge, I think that's an advantage for the U.S. because, well,
it should be.
You can accuse the Department of Defense of being command and control, or centralized command and control. Nothing is more centralized command and control than China, right? So I think
Russia.
And Russia. So I think it will be a challenge for each of those organizations to adjust to the realities of the
I mean, their culture is quite different. It's a top-down. It's a now hear this command. You may recall back in the Cold War days, those at the bottom could actually not transmit back to their leaders. They were just they were literally on receive. And so only those above them could actually transmit. So yes, and yet as a department, and then of course within the department the different services, because that's where the big money is. It goes directly to them. I just don't see the agility and the streamlined processes and all the rest of that to enable this kind of very rapid innovation and production and so on in the way that's happening in Ukraine.
And that has to change, and I worry it won't change until we get into our next conflict, and that will be too late. That we have to change it before the next conflict.
Senator McCain used to describe the forces that are here as the military-industrial congressional complex. And each element of that complex, there are lots of people with vested interests in legacy systems, legacy basing, legacy procedures, et cetera. And breaking that is really important to do, but very, very hard to do. And it's only when you're losing a war. I mean, the advantage of going in as the commander of the surge is we're losing this war. This country is out of control. 53 dead civilians due to violence every 24 hours just in the capital of Iraq at that time. And the desperation gives you some real advantages. Especially if you can actually turn it around. I mean, otherwise you got a real problem on your hands.
So we've touched on this already, but I want to come back and explicitly ask you a question. So then looking at the conflict in Ukraine, what are you observing happening there that's different or unique, or that we should be
first of all, the context is sort of unique. We've never had a transparency level like this, and therefore open source is staggering. If you aggregate it, if you bring it together, if you have rapid analytics and all the rest of this stuff, often machine-aided AI is starting to intrude and contribute here and so on, you can actually have a feel for this battlefield in a way that it took really highly classified stuff to do in the past.
Right,
And this is a result of everyone having smartphones on a battlefield for the first time.
Yeah.
Ubiquitous access to the internet, even if it's through Starlink or whatever, and then social media platforms onto which you can upload videos, pictures, recordings of Russian soldiers bad-mouthing their bosses, and all the rest of that. So that's very, very different and unique. Beyond that is just the impact of technologies that are very, very different from what we've used before. If you think about the Predators, the Reapers, these were all high-flying, incredibly capable, of course not threatened by air defenses. Here you have a very active air defense and electronic warfare environment, but thousands of these cheap drones that can be very, very effective. I mean, and of course, again, because of smartphones, internet access, and social media platforms, there's tons of videos out there of these smartphones actually doing what they're doing, which is to just follow right into the cab of a truck, into a hatch of a tank, into a window of a building and blow up inside it, all of this. And so this is for real. And the pace of innovation is, again, just, I mean, every garage and cellar, they're making drones. And it's not just air drones now. There's maritime drones that are very sophisticated. You also see longer range systems that the Ukrainians are using very impressively to go after Russian airfields and Russian energy depots, fuel depots, and the rest of that. And now they're going to bring in the land systems, which are going to be very interesting as well. You know, the truth is that I think all militaries, ours included, will need, this is very simplistic, but we'll need to transition from a small number of large platforms that are heavily manned, incredibly capable, also incredibly expensive, but increasingly vulnerable. Because if you're on the surface of the water and above, you can be seen, you can be hit, you can be killed.
In this ubiquitous surveillance world, you can be found.
Which is, again, another one of the features of this current battlefield, which is why it's so remarkable, by the way, the Ukrainians were able to surprise the Russians in this Kursk offensive. They cast it as a training exercise. But so from that structure, if you will, small number of large platforms to a massive number of small platforms, which increasingly are not just, and they're unmanned, they're not just remotely piloted, they're increasingly going to be algorithmically piloted. So the human in the loop is going to become the human on the loop, the human who first determines what the machine should do and then guides the development of the algorithm, which increasingly will be done by AI. So you can have rapid development of that as well. And then the machine goes and does what it's been told to do, and when it meets the conditions that have been established for it, it takes a kinetic or non-kinetic action.
So you and I have both been, I think, big evangelists of this transition that you're talking about from the small number of heavily manned, exquisite, expensive, uniquely manufactured platforms to cheap, unmanned, mass manufactured platforms. But you and I were in a part of a group conversation in Colorado a couple weeks ago where I would have thought that everyone would have figured this out and agreed with us, and that wasn't the case. There's still a set of people out there that think the lesson from Ukraine is actually this is traditional warfare.
And what's interesting about big ideas is once they're actually determined and proven right, everybody says, well, of course you did clear, hold, and build operations in Iraq. But you have to get to that first, and we're not there yet. I don't think people have really, again, it helps to have been going to Ukraine regularly, meeting with those individuals there, having them here, by the way. I've supported tech initiatives on stage in New York, out at Andrews Air Force Base and others. And I guess unless you're immersed in that, unless you're marinating in that, I don't think you come to the realization of how profound a change this is and how slowly we are actually reacting to it.
I agree with that. Tell me about your latest chapter about Gaza and what you think is lessons learned.
Well, first, I think it's very important to understand the trauma that the Israelis experience, because I don't think people have really in the U.S. And I've been there as well, and I know the Minister of Defense. I've had a lot of interaction with him. Keep in mind that we lost not quite 3,000 innocent civilians in 9/11 attacks. The equivalent for us of what Israel sustained would be 40,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage. Just think about that, and then try to understand how traumatic an event this was. And it still is heavily, obviously, this is going to weigh on Israelis at all levels forever, really. And then, as a result of that, I think it is very understandable. I agree with the objectives laid out by the Prime Minister and others initially, which is destroy Hamas, keep them from ever governing Gaza again, and get the hostages back.
Right, yeah.
They have very significantly degraded Hamas, and now because they've also taken control of the Philadelphia corridor in the south between the territory and Egypt, they now control that, and they're destroying all the tunnels that used to go underneath it, which used to convey weapons and ammunition and so forth. And they control the Rafah crossing, the major crossing, official crossing between Gaza and Egypt in the south. They can make it very difficult for Hamas to rebuild the military capabilities that it had. But they're doing clear and leave operations, just as we were prior to the surge, which means that every time you leave, yes, you've degraded them further, and they have been very seriously degraded, but you are not destroying them forever, because destruction has to include prevention of reconstitution. In fact, the military doctrinal term is to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. And they're not preventing reconstitution, and they're not achieving security, which is crucial if you're to resolve the issues of the humanitarian crisis experienced by the Palestinian people. I understand why they don't do that, because it would mean they would have to reoccupy Gaza. Not necessarily settlements, but with their security forces. We don't want them to do that, which I think is wrong-headed, frankly. I think you have to establish security. And the way to do it is sort of we had gated communities, we used to call it. You clear an area, and then you put walls around it, and you have an entry control point, and you keep the bad guys out. And then you can immediately restore basic services, reconstruction, everything else. You can't do that without security. The thinking is
the idea of trying to do that now? Or,
well, not yet.
I'm trying to read.
And the problem is that they're quite small as a professional.
That's true.
They're a reservist
They're
army.
a quick strike. They're not a sort of.
So this takes a lot more troops that have to bring them back on active duty, perhaps. But you just start small. Just come a mile in from the north, do an east-west wall. We used to put a wall up like that in multiple places every night in Baghdad and elsewhere, because that's how you create gated communities. And I used to tell the Iraqis, you spend a lot of money for a gated community in Florida. We're giving it to you for free here. We did 12 of them in Fallujah, for example. That was the solution to Fallujah.
Do they buy that?
So, and then a couple of north-south ones, or 2 or 3 of those. So you have a number of gated communities. And, it's only a mile in. You clear these painstakingly. And then cut entry control points to the rest of Gaza. By the way, everybody gets a biometric ID card. Israelis are great at that. And by the way, in the process of doing that, they'll identify people who shouldn't get that ID card because they filmed themselves carrying out atrocities on 10/7. So now those are clear. And then you rinse and repeat. Do it again. Go another mile. Again, the whole thing's only, you can do this very easily. It's a very small area, albeit densely populated. And when you get to Gaza City, that's you have to slice and dice that. But then once you have security, then you can get Arab forces to come in and help. Then you can get Palestinian security forces in from the West Bank that we might train and equip, for example. You can use contractors. You can use international and non-government organizations. You can have an organized distribution of humanitarian assistance, where right now, every time it goes right inside the border of Gaza, it gets hijacked by a criminal group or Hamas remnants, and Hamas is constantly reconstituting the people side of it, at least, even if they don't have the capabilities that they had in the past. So again, it's not an idea that is wildly and enthusiastically embraced, but I don't see an alternative. No one has, and of course there's not been, despite the Minister of Defense requesting it, despite former Minister Benny Gantz when he was part of the coalition, there has not been a political end state laid out for Gaza, other than that Hamas shouldn't be able to govern it. Well, if somebody else doesn't govern it, Hamas is still going to be there, along with, again, criminal groups and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and it's also just absolutely tragic for the Palestinian people. And I think it's really helpful, as we used to before we did Fallujah, Ramadi, Bakuba, Mosul. We say, we're going to make your life better. We're going to do it by getting al-Qaeda out of your life. We're going to keep them out of your life. We're going to have these gated neighborhoods and communities. and then we're going to rebuild it. And all of a sudden, within months, you have a transformed situation.
Right.
Now, there's not going to be quite the same openness to the presence of the Israelis that there was to us.
Yeah.
But if life is that much better, that's really, and then, by the way, I think the message to the world is a very positive one as well.
Right.
Because the truth is, even though there's a tendency to see all in Gaza as sort of Hamas, they really aren't.
Right.
And so I think that conceptually, in terms of big ideas, therefore, got a lot of good big ideas, a lot of good execution, although, again, you've got to minimize damage and destruction and loss of innocent civilian life without question, noting that there's 350 miles of tunnel underground that make that really hard to do because you got to penetrate to get to those. But they don't have all the big ideas, at least in accordance with my thinking, which is informed to a considerable degree by some pretty hard experience in Iraq in particular. Iraq was much more of an urban insurgency, whereas Afghanistan was very much a rural insurgency. So a very different situation, much bigger country and all.
Well, what a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
The privilege is mine. It is great. And it's also great to see your new headquarters here. And again, to be able to sit down with you a year and a half into your time as the strategic leader for a great
you know what?
organization.
I think we're going to hit the Belfour Center website there. I'm going to take some notes there as I think about my next exec team offsite. We're going to apply some of these our principles to what we're talking about. So I'm very excited about that. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for tuning in to today's episode of The Intersection. Please make sure to subscribe to the IQT podcast so you don't miss out on future content, and leave us a review or comment to let us know what you think or what content you'd be interested to see us cover in a future podcast. I'd also encourage you to check out IQT's website at www.iqt.org to explain more content, to explore, I should say, more content and learn about IQT's global investment platform that accelerates the introduction of groundbreaking technologies to enhance the national security and prosperity of America and its allies. General Petraeus, thank you so much here, and thank you to the audience for joining us at the Intersection today. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.